Greetings, Assalamu alaikum, welcome everyone. My name is Saqib Safdar and I'm your host and also the founder of the Hikmah Project. Today we'll be speaking to Jane Clark on her journey from physics to metaphysics, and that of Ibn Arabi in particular. But before we get into that, just a few updates. There's a new Hikmah Project site. It's still the same web address, thehikmahproject.com. Do pay us a visit. The podcasts are free. You can also click on subscribe, and through the various podcasting platforms subscribe to our podcasts. You can register as a free member, so whenever there's a new post you'll be notified. But also please do consider supporting the Hikmah Project either through a one-off payment or by becoming a member. It's literally about a cup of coffee per month, and you get access to all the posts, in which they are good quality transcripts, summaries of the posts, as well as any accompanying material to the podcast. And you also get an invite to the weekly reading circle. We are currently reading Imam Ali, From Concise History to Timeless Mystery, and are on chapter 2, and that's held at 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. UK time every Thursdays. The recordings are available as well if you can't make those times. So today we speak to Jane Clark. It's a very interesting person. She is a senior research fellow of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society and has worked particularly on the Society's archiving projects as well as looking after the library. She's been quite involved in preserving some classical manuscripts of Ibn Arabi, as she will explain. She started off as she first discovered Ibn Arabi when she was a PhD student studying quantum physics and was looking for a more comprehensive view of the world, and stumbled across Ibn Arabi, and this was sort of being raised as an atheist or as an agnostic, and so she had no religious inclination or wasn't seeking the truth or exploring various religious traditions. But she came across Ibn Arabi and things changed, and then she spent over 40 years studying Ibn Arabi and learning Arabic. She is engaged in teaching courses and lecturing on his thought both in the UK and abroad, and in researching and translation of the Akbarian heritage. She organises the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society Young Writers Award, as well as being a co-founder of the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and is also currently editor of the Bishara magazine. So, without further ado, here's a podcast. Welcome, Jane. Lovely to have you on the Hikmah Project podcast.
Lovely to be here.
So, just to start off, could you tell us about your journey to Ibn Arabi? What led you to him?
In inverted commas, it was a kind of coincidence, because I had no initial interest in Ibn Arabi, or in fact in any kind of spirituality. I came across Ibn Arabi in my mid-20s when I was a student at Warwick University. I was doing a PhD in solid state physics, which is a branch of quantum physics, and I was living in Leamington Spa, and there was a lot of conversation about spirituality, and people were looking at different gurus and such like, but I was quite a hard-nosed scientist actually, and I wasn't particularly interested in this. But one day somebody said, as people did, oh, it's a Sunday afternoon, we're driving down to this place called Swyre Farm in Gloucestershire, which was maybe an hour and a half away from Leamington. And so I went along for the ride, really. And we went to Swyre Farm, which was the first of the centres for the Bishara school. and it was a beautiful place in Gloucestershire. And they had a study group in the afternoon in which they were reading this introduction to Ibn Arabi, which became called the 29 pages because of its original length. And we joined in that study group. And I had no idea what was being said. I was completely ungrounded in any kind of theology. I'd been brought up by my parents to be as an atheist. I didn't have a Christian background or anything like that, over and above what you picked up through school and such like. So I had no idea what people were really talking about in that study group. But still, I got a sense that this was something that I wanted. And that's extraordinary to think back about that. I wasn't happy as a physicist. I was actually on the brink of giving up my PhD because I had a sense of I wanted something that was, in a way, a kind of answer to everything, I suppose you would say. I was looking for a really integrated theory. And somehow or other, I picked up that was it. And then soon after that, I gave up my physics PhD and I went into community work. I became quite political for a few years. And I used to go back occasionally to Swyre Farm because I'd liked it so much, but I was not at all serious about it. And then I had a little series of incidents, and I had a car accident. In fact, a motorbike accident. I used to drive a little motorbike, and somebody came out in front of me, absolute point blank, and nearly killed me. And I was unconscious, and I had a certain kind of experience then, which changed things for me, I think. And then a few months after that, I was a long time in convalescence. My hands were completely smashed up by this accident. So I was 5-6 months in convalescence. And during that time, I went back down to Swyre Farm for a period. And that's when it got serious. So, I had this initial introduction, and then when I went back after the motorbike accident, it was clear that this was something that was opening up for me. So then I ended up going on a long intensive course, which was run by the Bishara school. They used to do 8-month intensive courses of study. Wow. So that's when it got serious.
And for our listeners who might not be familiar with your background, how many years have you been studying Ibn Arabi for?
Well, I wouldn't count my first encounter, which was in about 1974, but I went on my first intensive course in 1977. And these intensive courses had been set up by a man called Bulent Rauf, who was a Turkish man, and he had come up through the Turkish Ṣufī tradition, and his parents, his family, had a strong connection to Ibn Arabi. In fact, his grandfather is buried in Ibn Arabi's tomb in Damascus, because Bulent was quite an aristocratic kind of an Ottoman Turk. And so his family, his grandfather had been the governor of Damascus. But his mother, some of the material that we used on later courses had come through his mother. So Bulent had this strong connection to Ibn Arabi. And in the UK, he had initiated really the study of Ibn Arabi. And when he set these long courses up, the core curriculum at the beginning of these courses was the study of Ibn Arabi. So we read 29 pages, and then we read chapters from the Fusus al-Hikam. And then after that, we moved on to look at some of the other traditions. So it's not Bishara is not a denominational school. It's not a school an Islamic school. So after we'd studied Ibn Arabi, we went on to look at the Christian tradition, and we looked at Bhagavad Gita, Tao de Ching, and such like. But the fundamental grounding was the study of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, because Bulent said, well, no, he lays out the unity of existence in the most explicit way. So wow. You start with that. That's your grounding. And then from there, you can look at all the other traditions and you can study other things. But the perspective, the unified perspective, is established through Ibn Arabi's teachings.
So I happen to have a background in physics. A physicist's mind is obviously very mathematical, very calculated. Obviously, there's a role of intuition, which Einstein constantly sort of talks about. And as you know, we have these sparks of creativity. But it's very different to, if you took the scientific mind and tried to critique metaphysics or religion, you often end up in these scenarios similar to Richard Dawkins, actually, saying, where is the objective sort of evidence for X, Y, Z? Yeah. And so what happened when you were studying Ibn Arabi? Were these mere concepts you agreed with, or was it more than just an academic study in which there was a level of intellectual agreement or disagreement?
Well, I think, certainly at the Bishara school, it's not academic study. These courses were not academic courses. They were residential courses. We were involved in, it was laid out into four aspects. So one of them was study of material, working with the mind. One of them was meditation. One of them was work, which is a service, serving the world, serving your fellow students, etc. And the fourth one was devotional practice. So those were the four elements of the course. So the underlying aim of the courses was and is within, because Bishara is still going, the same form of intensive course is no longer going, but Bishara as a educational organization is still going. The aim is always self-knowledge. So it's not knowledge of the world. And that's the distinction, really, I think, between what you would say a physicist is trying to do. You're trying to find out about the external world. Whereas what we were introduced to in the Bishara school was that knowledge is based on your own self-knowledge, not knowledge of who you are. And so that includes all aspects of yourself. And that's what did attract me initially, as I said, to Ibn Arabi, because you could see that physics was sort of edging towards a kind of unified perspective. You know, contemporary physics, it does this, but it's absolutely in the intellect, and it's not integrating the rest of the human constitution, your emotions, your actions, etc., etc. So the Bishara schools were aimed to at that level of knowledge, of actually being if you like, a transformative, personally transformative knowledge, not just facts or information about the world.
I'd like to read out a passage from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which I know they use at Bishara often at the beginning of reading text together. And it sets the intention. And this is from Book 1, Chapter 89, from 26 to 30. We empty our hearts of reflective thinking, and we sit together with God, al-Haq, on the carpet of adab and spiritual attentiveness, muraqabah, and presence and readiness to receive whatever comes to us from him, so that it is God who takes care of teaching us by means of unveiling and spiritual realization. So when they have focused their hearts and their spiritual aspirations on God and have truly taken refuge with him, giving up any reliance on the claims of reflection and investigation and intellectual results, then their hearts are purified and open. Once they have this inner receptivity, God manifests himself to them, teaching them and informing them through the direct vision of the inner meaning of those words and reports in a single instant. Could you comment on that and elaborate on what that means to you and what Ibn Arabi might have meant by that?
Well, this is might be an even larger subject than you think, actually. So one thing that we're talking about, the purpose of the Bishara courses and self-knowledge. One of the things that was emphasized on those was what is called the making of each individual, making a connection with reality, with the one reality, making their own connection with that. So there are ways where spiritual paths, where in fact you would come under the influence of a teacher, or in many Sufi tariqas, there would be a shaykh, and they would take you through different stages and such like, meaning that at least in the early stages, and I'm quite aware that this is a subtle matter of how this process of spiritual education works, but at least in the early stages, you're kind of under somebody else's order. But within the Bishara school, that was overtly, explicitly never the case. It was set up as a place where there were no teachers or gurus, but it was to do with each person making this private connection with the one reality. And this is very, very much in line with the way that Ibn Arabi talks about it. I mean, the idea comes from Ibn Arabi, really. And he calls this the private face, or this particular face, the wajh al-khas. So this is like a sort of private umbilical cord between each person and the one reality. And there is no intermediary in that connection. It's direct. And this is what this passage is pointing towards, that when you sit down and you study a text like the Fusus al-Hikam, in fact, when you say particularly the Fusus al-Hikam, actually I'll explain why I say that in a minute, but any text, any spiritual text, then from Ibn Arabi's point of view, you're not receiving, the knowledge, you're not imbibing the knowledge of this text as such. You're putting yourself into the place to receive knowledge from the place from which that text originally came. I mean, he would say this about Quran as well, that when somebody sits down to study the Quran, then what they're doing is placing themselves in the situation of receiving that knowledge from the same place that it came to Muhammad. So the Quran does not become an intermediary in your knowledge of yourself or your knowledge of God. I say particularly, there's a very, very vivid example of this, which I hope I can remember accurately. So there's a sort of little line of teaching from Ibn Arabi. So his principal disciple was Sadruddin Konavi, who was probably his son-in-law, and as you know, had an establishment in Konya. And Sadruddin Konavi took on pupils, one of whom was called al-Jandi, Muwaddin al-Jandi, who was one of the earlier commentators upon the Fusus al-Hikam. And al-Jandi, in a passage, describes an incident where he studied Fusus al-Hikam with Sadruddin Konavi. And he describes, and he says that he sat down to it and they were reading the introduction. And as he was reading the introduction, he received a kind of revelation. He went into a state in which he was sort of trembling and overtaken. And in that instant, the whole meaning of the Physis was revealed to him directly from the source from which it was written. So the process of teaching for him, this what he's trying to point out is to this matter of this private faith, that his imbibing of the knowledge of the Physis from Coincidently was not by means of going through it in an intellectual way, sort of unpicking every single thing, a single word, but by a kind of revelation from the same source. And then he told Sadruddin Coincidently, went to that, and he says, look, this has just happened. And Sadruddin Coincidently said, he said, that's just the same as happened to me when I sat down to read it with the shaykh. So so there's a specific, so this is a specific teaching example of what this passage you've read out, I think, is pointing at, that the knowledge is received directly from the source. It doesn't really come down through a kind of line of transmission where you're receiving the book and then you've got the knowledge of the book, etc., etc. It's coming directly from God. So that's how I would read what you're talking about.
That's amazing. And that actually reminds me about I wouldn't say it's a controversial topic, but it's one that obviously people have very clear views on in the Ṣufī tradition, and that's around the role of text. And one school of thought is to do away with text and engage in zikr and practice, because it's the experience the tasting that will, give you what you need. But clearly Ibn Arabi has written books that were, in his perspective, he was not the author of them. They were given to him. Yeah. And he was simply the scribe who wrote down everything that came to him, often in an instant. Yeah. And I believe in the Fusus, in the introduction, he says that this is for the Ahlullah and the Ashabul Qulub, the people of God and the people of the heart.
Yeah.
So clearly there is a role of the text in his teaching, which is not just mere academic study. He's addressing an audience who are presumably quite spiritually evolved, but it's not a series of do's and don'ts or academic concepts. There's something deeper going on there. So what would you say to this idea of, or the school of thought in which some mystics just put texts aside? And by extension, I'd probably add Rumi, just because of the era and the volumes he wrote in terms of Masnavi and Divan Shams, and obviously it's elaborating on love, but yet he has so much to teach and show. So what role does text play for a mystic?
Well, I mean, with Ibn Arabi, with the Ibn Arabi tradition, then he didn't set up a tariqah in the normal way. I mean, the way that knowledge would be passed down normally would be from master to student through a series of a kind of initiation or a transmission. And Ibn Arabi didn't set that up. It was made explicit. He did do that with Coincidently, and then Coincidently, there is a document that we have, which is his last will and testament, in which it's made quite explicit that this shouldn't happen. So this idea, Ibn Arabi did not set up a Sufi tariqah. So I'm not being critical here. I'm just saying it's a different matter.
Yeah.
What the knowledge was in the books. Yes. So it was an unusual situation maybe from the beginning, that it was always a matter that the knowledge was put into writing, and then the transmission is through the writing. So although you say the knowledge of the book came without actually directly to the heart, It's still the knowledge of the book that was happening here. So in the case of Ibn Arabi, it seemed to have been, I mean, one can talk about, I'm not going to say why this was the case, but it was the case that he didn't set up a tariqah. He did not set up if you, to this day, a Mevlevi sheikh can trace a line of lineage back to Rumi. A Qadiri sheikh can trace a line of lineage back to Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. But that's not the case with Ibn Arabi. There is no tariqah like that. What was preserved was the books. So to that degree, one would say that text has a particular place within the Akbarian tradition. But I think, the wariness that people have about text is this sort of subtle distinction that we're talking about. That again, what's required is not knowledge of the text. And then I think there is a danger with Ibn Arabi because it's so fascinating and so difficult to understand in places. And it's so kind of, there's so much to get your teeth into with it at a sort of metaphysical level that I think there is a danger of kind of over-intellectualizing. So I think the wariness that's within the tradition of text is of this confusing knowledge about something, about a text, with actually knowledge of its reality, of what the reality of what it's speaking about. So I think that's still that sort of distinction still applies within Ibn Arabi. But as I say, there's a special role for books, and you're aware maybe that there has been a very sort of special, seems to have been a very special dispensation on Ibn Arabi's books in the way that they've come down to us in the present day.
Could you tell us about when you study these other traditions, non-duality, Bhagavad Gita, Taoism, etc., did they give you what you found in Ibn Arabi, or does Ibn Arabi offer something far more comprehensive and universal?
Well, probably, I'd probably say both, actually. I mean, for one thing, one of the points of realizing it, of looking at the other texts, was because of the understanding, which is, of course, implicit to Islam anyway. There's only one reality. He appears in all sorts of different forms. So Islam recognizes both Christianity and Judaism as being valid religions, and acknowledge that these are places where the one has revealed himself in this form, revealed himself in Jesus, revealed himself in Muhammad, revealed himself in Moses, etc. So one of the points of looking at the other traditions was to actually see this. So to recognize the unity within these other traditions, but at the same time, I think every different revelation, if a different revelation in general didn't show you something new, there would be no point in the revelation, would there? See what I mean? So every different manifestation actually does show you something slightly different, or enriches your understanding of what the unity is. So I think both things are simultaneously true there. And it's also a good exercise. Ibn Arabi is very, very strong on not getting fixed in a belief. So it's a very good exercise to look at another tradition, which might, at least superficially, when you first look at it, might challenge some of your assumptions. You know, it makes you look at something and think, well, I thought it was like this, but this is saying it's different. How do I match those two? And very often you find that what happens in that process is that you're taken to a deeper understanding of what you thought. You'd put a limit, you'd understood something in a rather limited way. So, you know, so it's an expansive, that's the intention of it, as an expansive exercise. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes.
My father, oddly enough, became a Buddhist later in his life, and I had visited him at Samiling, which is close by what the present place of Bashara School, or for many years was the place of the Bashara School at Chisholm House in Scotland, which is just down the road. But I hadn't taken to it in anything like the same way. When I'd come across it. So, I mean, I suppose I'd been given a little bit of a choice between Buddhism and Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi just seemed like the right thing to do at that time. But I didn't go looking. I was the opposite, really, because I wasn't a person who thought that I was a spiritual seeker. And looked at all the traditions and thought, oh, look at this one, look at this one. I was the opposite. I wasn't a spiritual seeker. I kind of got sort of dragged into this by a sort of back door, rather to my surprise. So I discovered that whole side of life through Ibn Arabi.
Wow.
I did this first course at the Bashara School, where I was introduced to Ibn Arabi in my late 20s. And then I spent several years, there were several layers of courses to do with the Ibn Arabi, or the study that I did. And then as we did in my early 30s, I, got married, had a child, worked, took on a mortgage, all that kind of stuff that you do. And I continued study, but I was not it was a kind of evening occupation. And then in my mid-40s, I had a period of illness. I was very chronically asthmatic. I had to take time out of work, and it turned into about 4 years. I wasn't working, and as I came out of that illness, I had the idea of actually going much deeper into Ibn Arabi, and that's when I learned Arabic. When I started to learn Arabic, so all that time before then, I'd been working I'd been using translation. But then in my late 40s, I developed this urge to actually read the text in the original, and fortunately there was a little space because I'd been ill. My husband's business was doing quite well, and I went to Oxford to do a master's degree in medieval Arabic thought, which included learning medieval philosophical Arabic. So
oh, wow.
that's when I really began doing much more serious work on Ibn Arabi, and that's how I began to do translation and my involvement in other projects. So that was a kind of second phase of involvement.
Oh wow! So actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, because something I wanted to ask you is around. You mentioned the grace around the text and how they've come to us. Could you tell us about the versions or the copies of the works of Ibn Arabi that we currently have, and how they've come to us, and what sort of work you've been involved in terms of translation?
This was something that one of the things I did to help me to learn Arabic was I became the librarian for the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, which is based in Oxford, which had also been founded by Bulent Rauf, who I've mentioned as the consultant to the Bishara School. So the two things were connected, but the founding of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society was because Bulent had been brought up within the Akbarian tradition in Turkey, and he wanted to introduce it to English speakers, but he found that there were hardly any texts available. In fact, one of the reasons we have this strange thing called the 29 pages was that there was nothing actually in print at the time. So he had to sort of cobble together this kind of document in order to introduce us to the metaphysics. So the purpose of the Ibn Arabi Society was to encourage scholarship and translation of Ibn Arabi's works. And that was founded something like 1977. And it's actually been, whether it has been hugely successful or whether it was just founded at a time when there was a particular movement going on. But I mean, nowadays, there are hundreds and hundreds of translations of Ibn Arabi texts, and he's become very widely studied. Both in the Middle East and in the West, in Europe, in America. But it was so that was the foundation of the Ibn Arabi Society. So I became more involved in that when I was wanting to learn Arabic. And one of the projects that we began was called the Archiving Project, because there are hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts of Ibn Arabi's works, and even then there were loads and loads of editions in Arabic, but many of them were very inaccurate because they were very late. So translation, critical editions of Arabic works were being produced from very, very late manuscripts, which had all sorts of annotations and mistakes in them. So there was a kind of academic drive to go back to some of the earlier texts. All those earlier texts are most of them are in Turkey. They're still in Turkey, in the Turkish public libraries there. And something around 1998 or something like that, I can't remember, just before the millennia, there was a terrible earthquake in Istanbul, and some of the libraries were affected, and we almost lost a few of the most precious manuscripts of the Akbarian tradition. And at that point, the Turks, it's a different matter now, but at that point, the Turks were not very interested in their Ottoman heritage, and these manuscripts were being kind of neglected. And there was also at one point a major theft from the principal library where Ibn Arabi's works were kept in Konya. So there was a thought that we needed to preserve this heritage just in case it all disappeared in fire and flood. And so we set out to make digital copies. So we made the society, the Ibn Arabi Society, has created a digital archive of the earliest manuscripts of Ibn Arabi works. And that contains something like 3,000 copies of manuscripts now. So, and we created, in order to do that, I did this with my colleague Stephen Hertenstein. And in order to do this, we had to do a lot of research into which were the earliest copies, where were they, etc., etc. So that was a whole research project that's gone on for the last 20. For that, we started in about 2001, so about 20 years we've been doing that. So that's what the society did, and that's how my involvement came about. And what we discovered was that there are an extraordinary number of these early manuscripts. The major works by Ibn Arabi, you've already mentioned the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations. I mean, the extraordinary thing about Meccan Revelations is that we have a handwritten copy. We have Ibn Arabi's original handwritten copy of the second recension of that book. Apart from one volume, there are 37 volumes. There's one volume that's a facsimile, but the rest of it is we have that copy in Istanbul in the original hand of Ibn Arabi. And we also have not an original by Ibn Arabi of the Fusus al-Hikam, but we have a copy written by Sadruddin Konavi, which was copied during a reading session with Ibn Arabi, and which Ibn Arabi signs in 2 places to attest to its accuracy. So we have the 2 major works of Ibn Arabi's. We have actual attested or autograph copies of the original text. We have actually something, and I didn't look this up before this interview, so I can't remember exactly figures, but we have something like 66 manuscripts which actually have Ibn Arabi's handwriting, either written by him or attested to by him. So and this is absolutely extraordinary if you compare it with comparable figures. If you take Shahabuddin Suhrawadi, for instance, who was a contemporary of his, there's 1 manuscript. That's much more usual. I mean, we're talking about 1240. We're talking about 800 years. So the reason for this was that there were particular lines of preservation. So Sadruddin Konavi was the most important. He became Ibn Arabi's literary executor. As I already said, the heritage was really in the books. So Sadruddin Konavi, who was a wealthy man, set up a special waqf in Konya where these books, the books were kept and preserved. So the majority of them the major copies, the major preserved copies came through that, and then they transferred in the late 20s when the tariqas were all nationalized. They transferred to the Yusufiyya library, which is a little octagonal library at the gate of Mevlana's tomb, if you've ever been there. As you go in, there's this little octagonal building, and that's the Yusufiyya library where Ibn Arabi's heritage transferred to. But there were a couple of other lines of transmission. So it's extraordinary how much of original text we have from Ibn Arabi, either written by him, or actually in his handwriting, or written by very close members of his circle who have attestations that they copied it accurately from the original. So the written heritage has an extraordinary pedigree.
And so that's fascinating. And so in terms of 20th century printed copies, I know Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi had who was deeply steeped in Akbarian metaphysics, had a copy made, or a work sort of compiled, and Osman Yahya later on had obviously gathered various manuscripts to come up with a version. Could you tell us about the contemporary versions and why there was a need for that, and whether they are as accurate as the original manuscripts that we can now access?
Yes, yes, you realize that one of the interesting things, the reason that, again, that the manuscript tradition is so important, is you realize there was no printing in the Arabic world until mid 20th century, mid 19th century. So this is 1887 or something like that. We get the Futuhat coming into print. The Ottomans didn't like printing, and there were considerable difficulties setting Arabic in lead type. And so whereas we don't care about whether we have Shakespeare's original writings because we have the printed copies going right back, there were no printed copies. And so, hand-to-hand manuscript writing went on until the 19th century. So that's 700 years. when Abdul Qadir Jazairi had his supervised, I think it was the third imprint of the Futuhat, he sent it to Konya, which was to the Waqf of Sadruddin Konavi in Konya, to have it checked against the original that was at that time kept there. So over the centuries, when you do the research into the manuscripts, you see that it became a little bit of a centre, not so much of pilgrimage, but I suppose a kind of scholarly pilgrimage, that, you know, this Waqf in Konya, people would go there to copy the manuscripts, and if they wanted to get the good ones. So that first copy of the Futuhat was based on the original manuscript. What Osman Yahya did in the 1960s and 70s was he was preparing what's called a critical edition. So critical edition means that you take several manuscripts and you collate them to produce the best version. Normally you would choose one version and then you'd annotate. And the reason for that is that although it's wonderful to have the original autograph copy of the Futuhat in Ibn Arabi's hand, he doesn't always put the diacriticals in. So it's not always exactly clear what he meant. Sometimes it's difficult to read. His handwriting is very clear, but sometimes, nevertheless, things are difficult to read. So a critical edition is where you take different versions of the text and you compare and collate them so that somebody translating has got the best possible version to work from. And Osman Yahya worked on the two recensions of the Futuhat. That was his work, because, as you mentioned, actually, Ibn Arabi, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, as you know, was based on an original revelation that he had when he first went to the East in about 600. This is in Hijra. And he had a revelation of a youth circumambulating the Kaaba. And he describes that as the inspiration for the Futuhat. But the Futuhat is enormous. It's 9,000 pages long in the Arabic, 37 volumes, 560 chapters. It's huge. He took 30 years to write it. So he finished it in about the first recension in about 633. He produced a first version, complete version, and then he sat down and immediately rewrote the whole thing over the next 3 years. So I think that's about 636 that the final version is finished. And so we don't have the original of the first recension, but we have copies of it, copies that people took. So Osman Yahya was doing what's called this critical edition of comparing the two recensions.
Oh, I see.
He never completed it. He was intending it would have been about 30 volumes, and he got to about 14, I think.
Right.
Something like that. We do have a good edition now, which is based on the Konya manuscript, which has been done by Sheikh al-Mansub in the Yemen. So there's a group of scholars in the Yemen who have done some wonderful work on Ibn Arabi texts. And they have produced a really fine critical edition of the whole Futuhat.
Wow. And so just to be clear, two questions. Why did Ibn Arabi write out the Futuhat again? And I believe the second copy was done 2 years before he passed away. So he's obviously dedicated 3 intensive years to, rewriting that. And are the manuscripts currently in Konya, or have they now been moved to?
They're in Istanbul.
Istanbul,
now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Right.
They're both the Futuhat and the Fusus are now in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art. In the center of Istanbul, where they're very well looked after, I think.
Right.
So that answer, yes. Why he did it, And you'd have to ask Ibn Arabi that. I mean, I think people do find, I mean, I think not huge differences, but there are differences. Maybe, I don't know. I could imagine doing that if you've put something together. I mean, during that intermediate period when he was writing it, he was traveling for a lot of the time. He settled in Damascus at the end of his life, but there's an intermediate period, there's 20 years where he's constantly on the move, moving, you know, Cairo to Damascus, to, you know, to Malatya, to, you know, all over the place, to Mosul. And he was writing all the time when he was going. So maybe he felt it was all a bit bitty. I don't know. But that's what he did. It's an extraordinary feat because he was doing other things at the same period. I mean, then the period when he rewrote it, he was also writing out other works. He was collecting his poetry. He was doing this, he was doing that. I mean, it's an extraordinary feat of writing to have done that.
Given the multitude of works, and it's really a shoreless ocean, as Chodkovich rightly says, and it's very easy to turn it into an academic exercise, especially with Chittick's books on, you know, the book. And what I would like to know is, often people cite Rumi as the pole or the axis of love, but clearly Ibn Arabi had a lot to say around that. So could you say something around Ibn Arabi's experience and perspective on, or teachings on, love?
Oh, well.
It's probably a podcast on its own.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a central concept to Ibn Arabi. It's not so often, not so poetically put as it is within Rumi, but it's absolutely central. Well, for one thing to say is that for Ibn Arabi, love is the underlying motive for creation. So love, everything is underpinned by love. So you know that he loves this particular hadith Qudsi, this divine saying, which came through the mouth of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's from God. And so it says, you know, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. Therefore, I created the world that I might be known. So for Ibn Arabi, this is a central hadith. It's absolutely kind of, it's the foundational principle for his understanding of what the world is, and love is this motivating principle for it. So for him, everything in creation actually has its basis in love. You know, its beginning and also its movement. So everything in creation is this movement of love. So that's one thing to say about him. I mean, it's a wonderful vision that he has of this. And secondly, he talks personally about love. There is in fact, the first book that was ever brought into English by him is a book called the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the interpreter of desires, which is a cycle of poems addressed to the divine beloved, mostly a female divine beloved, a female Sophia, in which he talks very intimately about the experience of love in a mystical sense. So it's so there's that aspect as well, that he does talk about it and talk about himself as a lover. And he says at one point, in some of his, in the Futuhat, when he writes about his own spiritual experience. And one of the interesting things about Ibn Arabi is how modern he is, in that he does talk about his own spiritual experience. It's unusual in medieval writers. They don't normally. But Ibn Arabi says a lot about the teachers that he had and the experiences that he had. And at one point, he says he came to a point in his life where his beloved's face was with him, meaning the divine beloved was always with him. And he said, I'd want to eat, but I couldn't, because there was my lover's face. I couldn't eat because there they were. And he doesn't say in this experience whether it was just like, it was a kind of one of those things that happens for a short time or something, or whether it was something that happened for the rest of his life. He doesn't, you're kind of left with the thought that it was for the rest of his life, that he was brought into this state where, he always felt was always in the presence of his beloved. So it's a strong undercurrent. And I think, going back to the original question about the use of the intellect and such like, Ibn Arabi is very hard to understand. He's very intellectually sophisticated. I'm sure you'd agree.
Yeah.
And I think very often that clouds people's vision of what's really going on underneath in terms of what he's saying about love. And he and Rumi are completely at one, really, on this matter.
Jane, just a final question. If you could listen in on a conversation with Ibn Arabi and one more person, who would that person be? And what do you think they would say?
I don't know. I'd probably say Sadruddin Konavi, actually, because he regarded Sadruddin Konavi as he was his spiritual heir, and he treated him like a son. And there is a teaching, there is a document of their teaching sessions together, where Ibn Arabi, Sadruddin Konavi writes about, I studied this with the Sheikh, and then Ibn Arabi signs it and says, yes, he did. He studied this with me. These were like university degrees, like the equivalent of university, to sort of attestation that you had studied this. I mean, yes, I would just love to be present at one of those teaching sessions where Ibn Arabi is going through the Fusus with Sadruddin Konavi. I mean, I suppose that's
Super.
Yes.
Jane, thank you so much for your time today, and I really look forward to picking up this discussion and maybe exploring other strands of Ibn Arabi.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you again.
Likewise. Likewise. And
Okay.
until next time.
Until next time. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.